Bismillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah, wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We continue learning about the rational and spiritual principles in our beautiful faith that will allow us and help and assist us to make sound choices and better decisions in our lives. To recap what we've done so far, we've looked at the psychology of the human self, which is my inner landscape or my inner selfscape. And we looked at the components that make up the human being, the components that make up me, the I. And we looked at a number of components. We looked at the qalb, the spiritual heart. We looked at the nafs, the lower self. We looked at the aql, the intellect. And we looked at the senses or the jawarih. And we looked at all of these four components with respect to their roles and functions. Secondly, the relationships between them. And then lastly, we spoke briefly about how those roles and those relationships produce a process of inner decision making. When I make a decision, when I choose, make a choice, what is happening inside of me with respect to these components and what is the process? Now we are nearing the conclusion of our discussion on the spiritual principles, but there are 2 or 3 more topics to yet discuss. Today we want to look at the idea of freedom and happiness, a very essential, important concept that as Muslims I must have a clear picture about when we speak about the concept, the philosophical concept even of freedom. What does that mean as a Muslim? When I speak about the idea of happiness and wanting to be happy, what does that mean? How do we define that in the context of our tradition, of our spiritual and rational paradigm? And of course, this important point that when I choose, when any human being makes a choice, chooses to do something, chooses a course of action, they're doing that for the purpose of maximizing or optimizing their welfare or well-being. In other words, they're choosing for the purpose of being happy. Their choice is a means to the end of happiness as they understand it. So again, we come back to the point, what is happiness? I think, first of all, we should say this, that the understanding of happiness is premised on our understanding of human nature. What do we mean by that? It means that until and unless we understand who am I, what is my nature, what am I composed of, what is the human being, until we answer that question in a satisfactory, in a clear way, we will not be able to truly reach an understanding of what is freedom and happiness. Because as we define the human being, so too will that lead to an understanding, a conceptualization, and the search for happiness in light of that definition of the human being. We note, for example, and we said earlier, that all human beings pursue happiness as one of the most important goals of life, if not the most important goal for many in life. And as you know, the Constitution of the United States mentions that all men are created equal and everyone has the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And as a statement of constitutional principle, that's a statement about these inalienable rights, rights that cannot be taken away, that cannot be derogated, these inalienable rights that all human beings have. And we note in the Constitution, and as a statement of philosophy of the democracy of the United States, and like this, similarly in almost all other countries, there is this conjoining of life and freedom, liberty, and happiness, meaning that to live a dignified life, to live an honorable life, I must be free to choose. I must have the liberty to decide. Why? In order to pursue happiness. So all of this begs the question, though that is true, that's a true statement, I think, of human life, of human existence, of why we, what motivates us, what drives us, the pursuit of happiness. And we need liberty to pursue happiness. But all of that still begs this question: what kind of happiness? And as we saw, and I hope you appreciated the very beautiful, intricate way in which our faith explores this question at the most, at the deepest psychological, spiritual, human level. We spoke about different sorts of happiness, depending on different types of nafs. And we said there is a happiness that is based on hedonistic concerns only, and that is the happiness of the cow, which is one permutation of the lower self. And there's a happiness based on the pursuit of aggression, of violence, of merciless competition. And we said that that corresponds to the nafs that is sab'i, or predatory. And there is a sort of happiness that is also realized by satanic, shaitanic pursuits: lying, power, duplicity. And we said that there's a type of happiness, fourthly, that is connected to the angelic nafs, or the angelic self, which is the seeking of the infinite divine subhanahu wa ta'ala. So there are different kinds of nufus, of lower selves, and each nafs pursues its own happiness. And therefore, for us, and very importantly to understand, as we unpack and unravel this concept of happiness, in order to reach greater clarity, definitional clarity about happiness, there are different sorts of happinesses. And happiness is relative. There is no one happiness. Happiness is relative. And that happiness in our paradigm, as we are guided, as we were inspired to know by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and by His Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam, that these happinesses depend on the different permutations of the nafs. A hedonistic or violent or shaitanic happiness versus what we understand as Muslims to be a true happiness, the happiness of the angelic self, and nafs al-malaikiyya, the angelic self. And that happiness is not a happiness that is temporary or transient or stained or ultimately harmful, because of course we can have a happiness in the short term, an instant gratification, but that could be long-term pain and suffering and harm, both at the individual level and the collective level. Would you call that happiness? yes, in a very relative sense, an immediate, instant, gratifying happiness. But looking at the larger picture of the effect on me, on others, at different levels of my psychology, my emotions, my material well-being, my spiritual well-being, my intellectual well-being, in the long term, you wouldn't say that is happiness. It's relatively happiness to the short term and to my immediate experience. But the malaiki happiness, the angelic happiness, as we said, is a happiness because of the connection of the self to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to the source of everything, the source of beauty, the source of happiness, the source of all goodness, the source of all welfare, of all security, of all peace. And therefore this happiness must be nobler. It must be. And it must be more permanent, and it must be truer, and it must be, if we want to use the word, more authentic. And that the pursuit of this happiness and the pursuit of this nafs, this angelic nafs, leads me to realize my human potential as a steward or a vicegerent of the divine, meaning to reflect, as we said earlier, to reflect the beautiful attributes of the divine at my human potential. And that, in that lies my true self-actualization, my true happiness in the fulfillment of my human potential. The seed of potential that every human carries is this seed, to reflect the beauty and majesty of the divine at their human level. So that would be, now extracted from what we have learned, that would be a clearer, more practical, truer understanding of happiness and its relativity, and what we mean by the true pursuit of happiness as Muslims. The second idea that we need to discuss is the idea of freedom, liberty. And it should be said, and I think it is, we could make a case rationally for sure, that liberty, freedom is not an end in itself. I'm not free to be free, though in our contemporary discourse, we often use the word freedom as though it's a value or an end in itself, but it's not. Because I am free in order to pursue. Why am I free? Why do I want freedom? Freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of movement, freedom of choice. I want freedom because that freedom is a means to my happiness. That freedom is a means to attaining that which makes me happy. And so freedom or liberty is a means. It's an avenue. It's not an end. One way we could perhaps conceive of this is imagine having incredible freedom. Let me imagine I have incredible freedom. But that freedom of my choice, freedom of my words, of my deeds, of movement, all of that freedom that I have does not lead to a payoff of happiness. So whatever I do, whatever I exercise of freedom, let's assume as an experiment, a thought experiment, that it does not produce any happiness. Versus, I have limited freedom, much less freedom than in scenario A, much less freedom. However, that little freedom that I have produces an incredible amount of joy, of satisfaction, of contentment, of happiness. What would I prefer? Scenario A, a lot of freedom, no happiness, or scenario B, little freedom with an incredible amount of happiness. Most human beings, I think rationally, intuitively, would choose scenario B. I don't have much money, for example. I don't have much by way of means, for example. I'm restricted in where I live, for example. I live very humbly, but yet I have a heart and a mind that is truly happy. That's a life of a king, even though you may not have the kingly accessories or the kingly or royal means. And that's only to prove to us that liberty is a means, freedom is a means to happiness. Therefore, yes, Allah has given me freedom to choose, and I have the freedom of choice. But that does not mean that the freedom to choose leads to a good choice. It doesn't mean that the freedom is used in a wise way. It doesn't mean the freedom is used in a responsible way. And it doesn't mean the freedom is used in a way to make me truly happy. So life is the test of choice. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us, when Allah ta'ala demands accountability for us, that accountability is premised on choice. I have the freedom to choose. But that freedom to choose, in order for that freedom to be used well, it must be used responsibly for the right choices. And so we conclude by saying this. How is all of this relevant to the issue of choice? Well, when I make choices, as I plan, as I choose, as I analyze, as I decide, as I conclude and synthesize, my exercise of choice must be within this envelope of ilm, of knowledge. Must be within the envelope of knowing who I am, knowing the sorts of nafs that I have, knowing the source of happinesses that I may pursue, knowing the source of happinesses that I am inclined to pursue, the source of happiness that I, because of my nafs, am motivated to pursue, and to be self-aware of those energies inside of me. And therefore, my choice must always be analyzed within this, let us call it, this spiritual envelope of self-awareness. What is happiness? What is the happiness that I am seeking in the decisions that I make? Is it the happiness of, to be blunt, a cow? Is it the happiness, to be blunt, of a pig? Is it the happiness of a wolf or a hyena or a predator? Is it the happiness of a shaitan? Is it the happiness of an angel? So my rational calculation and choices must always be within this constant, this envelope of spiritual constants that will help me, insha'Allah, modify and modulate and contextualize the choices that I make. And that is why, insha'Allah, I hope you would see and agree with me that this topic of happiness and freedom is so important to the idea of choice. May Allah Ta'ala bless you and reward you and guide you and us to what He loves in our choices. And please join us as we continue our journey of choosing well and making best decisions in life. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.